Lena knew something was wrong the moment the phone rang. It was early on a Wednesday morning just before sunrise, and the cold wind slicing through the city of Chicago seemed to seep straight through her apartment window. She had just wrapped her hands around a warm mug of coffee, trying to shake off the fatigue from another late night at the office, when the phone vibrated with a tone she had come to dread, the hospital's number. Her heart sank before she even answered. Lena stood frozen in her tiny kitchen, the mug slipping from her fingers and shattering on the linoleum floor. She didn't cry, not right away. The news was too abrupt, too devastating, as though her mind needed a few minutes to process that her world had just cracked open. George had been everything to her. Her mother died when she was 6, and since then her father had filled every role: protector, teacher, friend. Even in his later years, frail and forgetful, he would call her every night just to say, "You're doing good, baby girl." Lena made it a point to visit him at least once every 2 weeks in Iowa, where he stayed in a modest retirement home. She had planned to bring him new slippers on her next visit. Now she'd never get the chance. Grief would have to wait. Lena quickly packed a suitcase, called the retirement home, and arranged for the funeral. Her hands shook as she typed up a formal leave request, citing family emergency, and sent it to her boss, Ms. Harper, with the subject line, "Funeral leave request urgent." Ms. Harper, ever cold and by the book, replied within minutes, "Approved, take the necessary time." No condolences, just clinical approval, but it was enough. By that afternoon, Lena was on a Greyhound bus, pressing her forehead to the window, watching the familiar cornfields blur past as her thoughts raced through every childhood memory, every quiet Sunday with her father, every Christmas morning he made her pancakes in the shape of snowmen. She tried to hold on to those memories like life rafts in a sea of sorrow. The funeral was held 2 days later, small, quiet, and dignified. A handful of relatives she barely knew came to pay their respects. Lena delivered the eulogy herself, her voice trembling as she read from a yellowed page of notebook paper. "He wasn't a man of many words," she said, "but he always said the right ones." On the third day, she stayed behind to help sort through his belongings: old military medals, postcards from places he'd never visited, and a rusted toolbox he once told her belonged to his own father. She found a folded letter addressed to her tucked inside his Bible. It simply read, "I'm proud of you, Lena. You've done more than I ever dreamed. Keep going." By Sunday night, she returned to Chicago with sore eyes, a sore heart, and a resolve to carry on. She needed routine. She needed her job. On Monday morning, Lena walked into the office building with her ID badge clipped to her coat and her heels clicking against the marble floor like punctuation marks in a sentence she was determined to finish. But something was wrong. Her access card didn't unlock the main door. A red light blinked. She tried again, nothing. The security guard recognized her and let her through manually, giving her a puzzled look. She smiled awkwardly and said she'd check with it. When she got to her desk, her computer login had been deactivated. Her phone extension rang a dead tone. Confused, she checked her emails on her phone and found none, not a single message. That's when a calendar alert popped up on her screen. Meeting with HR and Ms. Harper, 9:00 a.m. Puzzled and already emotionally raw, Lena walked into the HR office a few minutes early. Ms. Harper sat across from her with a stiff spine and a colder stare than usual. The HR representative, a young man named Patrick, looked uncomfortable. "Lena," Ms. Harper began, her tone clipped, "you failed to report to work for 3 consecutive days last week. This constitutes job abandonment." "You did not submit formal documentation for your leave," she continued. "And while we understand personal emergencies can be difficult, this company cannot function with unreported absences." "But I have your email," Lena said quietly. "You approved it." Ms. Harper's face remained expressionless. "We have no record of that." Patrick shifted in his chair. "Unfortunately, given the circumstances and lack of communication, your employment has been terminated effective immediately." Lena felt a roar of white noise in her ears. Fired? After 5 years of loyalty, overtime, meeting impossible deadlines, after sacrificing holidays and weekends for the company. She opened her phone, pulled up the email thread, and slid it across the table. Ms. Harper gave it a glance and then looked away. "This doesn't meet our HR protocols for formal leave submission." "But you said," Lena started, then stopped herself. There was no point. The decision had already been made. She had buried her father, and now they were burying her career. She walked out of the building in a daze, her exit unceremonious. No goodbye lunch, no thank you card, just the echo of her heels against the cold tile and the taste of humiliation in her mouth. Outside, the wind had picked up. Lena stood at the corner, waiting for the bus, her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders. She could still hear her father's voice, "Keep going, baby girl." She looked up at the gray sky, swallowed the lump in her throat, and made herself a quiet promise. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning. She just didn't know yet how far that beginning would take her. Lena didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her couch in the dim light of her living room, replaying the HR meeting in her head again and again, like a cruel joke on loop. Her father's funeral had barely passed, and already the world felt colder, harsher. Every room in her small apartment seemed unfamiliar now, as though she were floating through someone else's life. She wanted to scream, but there was no one to scream to, no mother, no father, no partner, just silence and the sharp absence of everything she'd spent years building. By morning, the exhaustion had settled into her bones, but it didn't dampen the quiet fire beginning to burn inside her. That email thread with Ms. Harper, she still had it, and Lena had never deleted a single piece of correspondence. If there was one thing her father taught her, it was to always keep receipts. She pulled out her laptop, opened her inbox, and began tracing the timeline. Her original request, Harper's approval, the exact timestamps, the subject line, the confirmation. She took screenshots. She backed up files to the cloud into a flash drive. Then she opened her secondary inbox, the one she rarely used, and found something she hadn't expected. It was from Marcy, one of the senior designers on Lena's team. "Hey, Lena. I just wanted to say I'm so sorry to hear what happened. I know we're not supposed to talk about it, but I thought you should know. Harper said in the team meeting last Thursday that you took time off without regard for deadlines and that she'd be making an example out of it. It didn't sit right with me. I hope you're okay." Lena's stomach twisted, so it wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was premeditated, a power move. She had been sacrificed for control. Something inside her clicked. She opened another tab and began researching employment law in Illinois. Terms like wrongful termination, retaliation, and documented leave approval began popping up. She read until her eyes blurred, until the legalese started to resemble something solid, something she could stand on. Her email was more than just a message, it was evidence. The next day, she scheduled a free consultation with a law clinic that specialized in labor rights. The office was tucked into the third floor of an aging building in Lincoln Park, with peeling wallpaper and a smell of dusty carpet, but Lena didn't care. She met with a woman named Sharon Patel, a sharp-eyed attorney with a calm demeanor and a notebook full of questions. Lena laid everything out, the email, the funeral, the meeting, the screenshots, even Marcy's message. When Lena finished, Sharon leaned back in her chair, her fingers laced together thoughtfully. "You have a strong case," she said. "Not only were you wrongfully terminated, but it appears there was retaliatory intent. That message from your colleague, if she's willing to verify it, could point to malice." Lena blinked, stunned. "So I can sue them?" "You can file a complaint with the Illinois Department of Human Rights and potentially pursue damages through civil court. You won't get your job back, but you could be compensated for emotional distress, loss of income, and even punitive damages." It felt surreal. Just 48 hours ago, she was crying over a coffin. Now she was planning to take down the woman who had stomped on her grief. She wasn't out for revenge. She just wanted to be treated like a human being. Sharon handed her a list of next steps, formal complaint forms, a timeline to submit documents, and a request to preserve all written communication. "And Lena," she said before Lena left, "don't talk to anyone at your old job without consulting me. No calls, no emails, everything goes through us now." Lena nodded. She understood the game had changed. Back at home, Lena drafted her official statement. It took her most of the night to write, not because she didn't know what to say, but because every sentence carried the weight of humiliation and heartbreak. She read it aloud, then rewrote it. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't let people walk over you just because you're kind." The following week moved slowly. While Sharon worked on filing the complaint, Lena started receiving text messages from former coworkers. Some were kind, offering condolences and quiet support. Others were more guarded, afraid of getting involved. Then came an anonymous envelope slid under her apartment door. Inside were printouts of internal emails, ones she'd never seen before. Harper had written to the executive team, "Let's address Lena's behavior directly. We can't have staff treating deadlines like suggestions. If we tolerate this once, others will expect the same leniency." Another email, timestamped just a day before Lena returned. "She won't push back, she's too meek, this will be a clean break." Lena sat down on the floor, her breath shallow. Someone from inside the company wanted her to fight. They couldn't say it aloud, but they had sent her a lifeline, and now she had more than enough. Sharon was stunned when Lena delivered the documents. "This isn't just a case anymore," she said. "It's a campaign of humiliation." The official complaint was filed 2 days later. The law clinic prepared a press release, not for the newspapers but for their own website. Lena's name wasn't mentioned, but the story of her firing was laid out in simple, powerful language. It began gaining traction. Small outlets picked it up. Then a local labor rights podcast reached out. "Would you be willing to share your story anonymously?" the host asked. Lena hesitated. She was scared, but also she was tired of being scared, so she said yes. In the podcast, her voice trembled but stayed firm. She told them about her father, about the funeral, about the woman who looked her in the eye and erased 5 years of loyalty. She ended her segment by saying, "Grief doesn't make you irresponsible, it makes you human. And if companies can't understand that, they shouldn't be allowed to lead people." The episode went viral within a few days. Comments flooded in, people sharing their own stories of being punished for choosing family over work. One wrote, "Thank you for speaking out, you made me feel less alone." Another said, "This story broke me, then it made me strong." Ms. Harper didn't respond publicly, but Lena heard from a former coworker that there was tension in the office. Meetings had become colder. Rumors flew that the board was beginning to take notice. Lena didn't celebrate, she still had bills to pay. She took up freelance projects, designing websites for small businesses, offering brand consultations over Zoom. The money wasn't much, but every dollar felt earned with integrity. Every new client reminded her that she was more than what Harper had tried to reduce her to. One night, while finishing a design draft for a bakery's logo, she received a text from Sharon. It read, "They want to settle." Lena stared at the screen. She hadn't expected that, not this soon, not without a fight. "Let's talk in person," Sharon replied, "but they're scared and that means we're winning." For the first time in weeks, Lena felt a strange calm settle over her. She closed her laptop, stood by the window, and looked out over the city she had once felt swallowed by. Now it looked different. It looked like a place where she could build something new, something better. She didn't know where the road ahead would take her, but she was ready to walk it with her head high, her heart steady, and the fire still burning inside her. Because Lena Adams was no one's example to be made. She would write her own. The settlement meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10:00 a.m. inside a quiet legal mediation office just north of the Loop. Lena arrived early, dressed simply but deliberately, a navy blue blouse tucked into gray slacks, hair pulled back, a leather folder clutched tightly in one hand. She didn't come to look like a victim. She came to look like someone who had survived, someone who deserved to be heard. Sharon met her at the door with a reassuring nod. They sat together in a small conference room with tall windows and sterile decor, the kind of place designed to feel neutral but ended up making everyone uncomfortable. Across the table, a representative from the company's legal team sat, along with Ms. Harper, who barely acknowledged Lena. Her expression was stone, as if she still believed she had the upper hand. The company's attorney, a man named Richard Klein, opened with a tight smile. "Ms. Adams, thank you for coming. We want to begin by saying we regret the misunderstanding that occurred and the pain it may have caused you." Lena said nothing. She let Sharon speak first. "My client is here not because of a misunderstanding," Sharon said coolly, "but because of a deliberate and calculated decision made by your client to punish her for grieving. Let's not frame this as miscommunication. We have receipts." Klein cleared his throat. "Of course. That said, the company is prepared to offer a severance package equivalent to 6 months of Lena's former salary, contingent upon signing a non-disclosure agreement." Lena raised her eyebrows. That wasn't nothing, but it wasn't nearly enough. Sharon shook her head slightly and leaned forward. "You're asking her to accept silence in exchange for half a year's worth of income after you fired her for attending her father's funeral. That doesn't even begin to account for reputational damage, emotional trauma, and the public interest this case is now generating." Harper crossed her arms. This was never personal, it was about expectations and policy. Lena finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but every word felt like a slow, deliberate strike. "You approved my leave, Ms. Harper. I was burying my father, not vacationing in the Bahamas. And then you used my grief to make a statement to the rest of the team. You lied to HR, you gambled on me staying quiet, and now you're sitting here pretending this wasn't personal." Harper opened her mouth to respond, but stopped short. For the first time since Lena had entered the room, the edge of certainty in the executive's eyes began to dull. "Here's what we want," Sharon said, laying a printed document flat on the table. 12 months severance. A formal apology issued to Lena in writing on company letterhead, and no NDA. Klein scoffed. "That's not a negotiation, that's a demand." "That's correct," Sharon said. "Because we know what happens if this goes to court. Your internal emails, the screenshots, the podcast interviews, this company will be seen for what it allowed to happen. And if we go public, it's not just about one termination. It becomes about every other voice that stayed silent until now." The silence stretched. Harper's jaw tightened. Klein conferred with her in hushed tones, turning pages in a folder Lena couldn't see, then he looked up. "We'll take it under advisement and respond by the end of the week." Sharon nodded. "You do that, we'll be waitings." Back on the street, Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sharon placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did great, that room, you owned it." Lena shook her head, a mix of adrenaline and disbelief still coursing through her. "I don't feel like I won anything yet." "It's not about winning," Sharon said, "it's about setting something right." Later that evening, Lena sat at her desk and watched the sun go down over the skyline. The light turned her apartment gold for a few minutes, everything glowing, even the framed photo of her and her dad on the bookshelf. She thought about how proud he would have been. He was the kind of man who believed in fairness, who told her when she was 9 and crying over a stolen lunchbox, "Don't let people take from you just because they can." The next morning, Lena's phone buzzed with a message from Sharon. They've agreed all terms, no NDA. Lena stared at the screen. A warmth spread through her chest, part validation, part relief. Not because she had won money or because someone had finally said sorry, but because she had made it through the fire without losing herself. The formal apology arrived via email later that day. It was cold, corporate, and brief, but it acknowledged fault. A copy on letterhead followed 2 days later. But the biggest ripple hadn't even started yet. 3 days after the settlement, Lena received an anonymous tip in her inbox. The subject line read, "You should know what else she's done." Attached were several PDFs and screenshots detailing similar incidents under Harper's leadership: sudden firings, verbal abuse, HR reports buried or erased. One included a testimonial from a former employee who claimed to have been dismissed for missing work due to a miscarriage. Lena forwarded everything to Sharon. "We need to report this," she typed. The law clinic began contacting other victims, building a broader case. A journalist at a mid-sized Chicago newspaper caught wind and requested an interview. Lena declined to speak on the record, but the story ran anyway, focused on systemic abuses of power in corporate leadership and the culture of fear within certain departments. Within a week, Harper was placed on administrative leave. Within a month, she resigned. Lena didn't dance, she didn't celebrate, but she did breathe easier. She took long walks again, went to the farmer's market, slept through the night without waking up from dreams of boardrooms and funeral flowers. One Thursday, she visited her father's grave. She brought coffee black with 2 sugars, just how he liked it, and sat on the grass beside his stone. For a while, she said nothing. Then she began to talk, just like she had as a kid when her day had gone wrong. "I stood up, Dad, even when it hurt, even when I was scared." The wind rustled through the trees like an answer. She took a deep breath, stood up, and walked back toward her car with the quiet strength of someone who'd weathered more than she thought she could. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was hers again. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. The month following Ms. Harper's resignation passed in a strange, quiet sort of triumph. Lena didn't post about it online, didn't speak to the media, and never once gloated. But something had shifted deep inside her, a sense of reclamation, of power retrieved. For the first time in years, she wasn't waking up dreading her inbox. She wasn't shrinking in meetings or replaying corporate slights in her head late at night. Still, that didn't mean the road ahead was suddenly easy. Severance covered the rent and groceries, but Lena knew it wouldn't last forever. She had to find work, real sustaining work. But returning to the same kind of environment she just escaped felt impossible. The thought of sitting through another interview where someone smiled too wide and asked how she handled high-pressure situations made her nauseous. Instead, she started small, freelance gigs. Brand redesigns for local bakeries, yoga studios, and eco-conscious soap company run by 2 sisters out of their garage. Lena poured herself into each one not just for the money, but because every new client reminded her that design could be a form of care. She wasn't creating for shareholders or PowerPoints now. She was telling stories, building identities, giving shape to dreams. Word spread quickly, clients referred friends, friends became repeat clients. She launched a simple website with her name, Lena Adams Design.com, and showcased her growing portfolio. Her inbox began to fill with inquiries. She set her own hours, chose her own projects, and for the first time felt like her work had meaning beyond the next performance review. But even as business trickled in, something felt unfinished. Her father's death had left a hollow space she hadn't dared explore fully. She'd moved too fast, maybe out of survival. She'd fought the battle, won the war, but hadn't truly stopped to grieve. One rainy evening in late October, Lena sat curled up on her couch, flipping through a worn leather journal her father had given her for her 25th birthday. The first page simply read, "For when you forget how strong you are." Beneath that, blank pages waited. She hadn't written a word in it since the day he died. That night, she began to write. At first it was clumsy, just scattered thoughts, memories of growing up in Iowa, the way her dad used to make grilled cheese with too much butter, the quiet strength of his hands. But gradually the writing became ritual. She wrote every morning, then every night, not for an audience, just for herself. And in those pages, an idea began to form. What if she wasn't the only one? What if there were others? Women, workers, people who'd been told their grief was unprofessional, their humanity a liability? What if someone created a space where stories like hers could be heard, not hidden? She drafted a new concept, a community platform for storytelling and design, a hybrid space for people navigating grief, burnout, and career reinvention, a place where trauma wasn't buried under LinkedIn polish but honored. She called it Ray Human. The tagline came to her one morning over coffee, "Work with soul." She didn't know if it would work. She had no investors, no roadmap, but she had time, a laptop, and a story that wouldn't leave her alone. She spent the next 6 weeks sketching wireframes, building mock-ups, and reaching out to people she respected: therapists, career coaches, creative professionals who'd left toxic jobs and reinvented themselves. To her surprise, they didn't just respond, they joined her. One offered to build out the back end for free. Another connected her to a local university's entrepreneurship lab. She applied for a small grant through a nonprofit that supported women-owned startups. She didn't expect much. She got it. The day the approval email landed in her inbox, Lena sat back in her chair and laughed, not out of disbelief, but out of something older and deeper: relief, gratitude, maybe even joy, the kind her father would have grinned at, saying, "Told you the wind would change." Ray Human launched in beta form 3 months later. The site was simple but intentional: curated stories from people rebuilding their lives after loss, burnout, layoffs, a small marketplace for design and wellness services, a private forum where members could connect without judgment. The first week saw only a handful of visitors. But then a story Lena wrote, "I buried my father and my career in the same week," was shared on a digital magazine. The response was overwhelming. Emails poured in, not from journalists but from people, real people: a nurse who'd been reprimanded for crying after a patient died, a young man fired during bereavement leave, a teacher who had to return to class the day after losing her husband because the school district had no substitutes. They didn't want justice, they wanted to be seen. Lena saw them. She replied to every message. She invited them to write, to share, to build. Ray Human became more than a website, it became a sanctuary. And somewhere in the middle of it all, between coding sessions, story edits, and long evenings at her kitchen table with herbal tea and Spotify playlists, Lena realized she was healing. Not just surviving. Not just proving Harper wrong. But rediscovering who she had always been before the world tried to make her smaller. One night she received a message through the site's contact form. The name made her blink twice: Marcy. "Hey Lena. I've been following everything you've built. I just wanted to say thank you. After what happened, I left the company too. I couldn't stay under that kind of leadership. I work for a nonprofit now, less money, more heart. I'm happier, I hope you are too. If you ever need a collaborator, I'd love to help." Lena smiled. She looked around her apartment, the same space that once felt like a tomb, and saw it differently now, as a launchpad, as a home. She wrote back that night, "Let's build something together." Because the truth was, she wasn't alone, and maybe she never had been. She just needed to lose the wrong things to find the right ones. And now at last, she was building something no one could fire her from. She was building something that mattered. By the time spring arrived in Chicago, Ray Human had grown from a quiet project to a movement. What had begun as Lena's small act of reclamation, an online space for people recovering from grief, burnout, and toxic work cultures, was now attracting attention far beyond what she had imagined. It wasn't just the heartfelt stories or the elegant design of the platform that drew people in, it was the sincerity. It was the fact that every word, every interaction felt real, grounded. The platform's growth wasn't viral in the flashy, trending sense. It was slow and organic, like roots stretching beneath the soil. People found it through whispers, through word of mouth, through quiet recommendations from therapists or friends who had once felt the same weight Lena had carried. Each day brought new members: a firefighter recovering from PTSD, a woman rebuilding her life after divorce, a tech worker who had walked away from a 6-figure job to care for his dying mother. Lena worked harder than she ever had at her old job, but she didn't feel depleted. She felt alive. She curated content, moderated discussions, mentored young designers, and led virtual workshops on trauma-informed branding. She collaborated with Marcy on a weekly newsletter called The Second Sunrise, which featured a new story every Sunday about someone who had found light again after darkness. One Sunday morning, Lena opened her inbox to find a message with a subject line that simply read, "Thank you." It was from a woman named Janelle, a single mother from Baton Rouge who had been fired from her retail job after missing a shift to attend her son's emergency surgery. "I was ready to give up on everything," the email read. "Then I found your story. I read it 3 times. I cried like someone finally saw me. I wrote my own story and posted it in the forum. 3 people reached out, 3 strangers who now feel like friends. You didn't just build a website, Lena, you built a lifeline." Lena sat at her kitchen table, coffee growing cold in her hands, staring at the screen with tears in her eyes. She didn't know Janelle, she might never meet her. But somehow, across states and circumstances, they had found each other. That was the magic of Ray Humans. Requests for interviews began to trickle in. Local journalists, online publications, even a public radio program asked to feature the platform. Lena was reluctant. She didn't want to become the face of anything. She wasn't looking for celebrity. But after speaking to Sharon, who reminded her that sometimes visibility could protect a cause, she agreed to appear on one show. The host, a warm-voiced woman named Rayleigh, met Lena at a recording studio on the North Side. The interview was quiet, thoughtful. Lena talked about her father, about losing her job, about the weight of silencing grief in the workplace. She talked about healing not as a straight line, but as something circular, something we return to again and again, deeper each time. When the episode aired, traffic to Ray Human tripled. That night, Lena stood on her apartment's small balcony and looked out over the city. Lights flickered like distant stars. She breathed in the spring air, cool, damp, alive with the scent of blooming lilacs, and felt a moment of peace settle over her. It wouldn't last, but that was okay. Peace, like grief, came and went. What mattered was building something that could weather both. A week later, she received a formal invitation from a national mental health summit in Boston. They wanted her to speak on a panel about trauma-informed entrepreneurship. Her first instinct was to decline. The word entrepreneur still felt strange in her mouth, like it belonged to someone with an MBA and a 5-year growth plan. But Sharon reminded her again, "You're not going for them, you're going for the people in the room who need to hear what you've lived." So Lena packed a suitcase, boarded a plane, and walked onto a stage in front of 200 people who had no idea what she'd been through. She spoke slowly, clearly. She didn't memorize anything, she told them the truth. "I used to think being strong meant pushing through, staying quiet, being grateful to be in the room. Then I buried my father, and the same week I lost my job, not because I failed, but because my grief was inconvenient. And from that moment on, I stopped trying to survive the system. I started building something better." The applause wasn't thunderous, it was something quieter, more respectful, the kind that comes from people who recognize their own story in yours. After the panel, a small group gathered to speak with her. A college student with anxiety, a woman in her 50s considering leaving a 30-year career, a young father who wanted to know how to honor his late wife's memory through service. Lena stayed long after the other speakers had gone, answering questions, exchanging emails, listening. On the flight back to Chicago, she sat by the window and thought about her father again, about the way he used to fall asleep in his recliner with a book open on his chest, about how he always left the porch light on when she came home late, about how somehow he'd still managed to guide her even now. At home, she found a letter in the mail from the Grant Foundation that had first funded her idea. They were expanding their funding for second-stage startups and invited her to apply for an accelerator program. It came with mentorship, financial support, and a chance to scale. Lena knew what she wanted to do. She wanted to build local chapters, not just online stories, but real-life community gatherings, monthly story circles, design workshops, shared meals. She imagined spaces in libraries, coffee shops, co-working spaces, places where people could sit across from each other and say, "This happened to me too." She submitted her application. She proposed a year-long pilot program with 5 cities. She included testimonies, metrics, and a vision to make healing visible, to make grief something we no longer had to hide. She got the grant. That summer, Lena and a small team of volunteers launched the first Ray Human Community Hub in Chicago. The opening event was held in a modest community center with folding chairs, homemade snacks, and a sign on the wall that read, "Come as you are, we'll meet you there." Dozens of people came, some just listened, some cried, some told their stories for the first time out loud. And Lena, sitting in the back, notebook in hand, realized something that took her breath away. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was a movement. And it had only just begun. The success of Ray, Human's first community hub, felt like a dream realized, until reality knocked again. It started with a single email. A major tech publication had been planning a feature on mental health platforms and had shortlisted Ray, Human, for a spotlight article. They wanted to conduct a background review, standard protocol. Lena felt proud and prepared. Everything was transparent. The platform's values were clear. The finances were tight but clean. She sent over what was requested. A week later, the follow-up came, but not in the way she expected. The journalist sounded hesitant on the phone. "Lena, there's something we found that you should be aware of." Apparently, a former Ray Human member, someone Lena had once banned for violating community guidelines after repeatedly posting inflammatory content, had written a blog accusing the platform of censorship, favoritism, and exploiting trauma for profit. The article was full of distortions and personal bitterness, but it was long, well-written, and gaining traction online. Lena felt the old nausea return. The same twisting in her gut she'd felt when Harper accused her of job abandonment. She had thought this was behind her having to defend her dignity, but this time it wasn't a boss in a conference room. It was strangers online with usernames and pitchforks. Within hours, a handful of hate comments appeared on Ray Human's pages, then emails. A few community members left quietly. One sponsor asked to pause their support until things settled. Marcy called her late that night. "We'll weather it," she said. "We always do." But Lena couldn't sleep. She kept going back to the beginning, to her father's funeral, to being fired in a moment of grief, to the path she'd taken since. She had built this from the ashes of loss, not for validation, not for money, but because no one had made space for her when she needed it most. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, then opened her laptop and wrote a letter not to defend herself but to tell the truth. She called it When Kindness is Misunderstood. It was posted on the front page of Ray Human. I didn't create this platform to be liked, she wrote. I created it because grief isolates us. I created it because being told to move on after a death broke something in me, and I promised myself that no one would feel that unseen again if I could help it. I know there will be criticism, that's okay. What I won't accept is fear-mongering masquerading as truth. If you found something good here, hold on to it. If you haven't, I wish you peace. The post went quietly viral, but not because of anger, because of grace. Dozens of replies, comments, and private messages poured in. People who had never written before shared what Ray Human had given them: courage, comfort, connection. One woman wrote, "You saved my life last December. That man's blog doesn't speak for us, you do." Another said, "I don't know what your boss took from you, but I know what you gave to us." Lena cried for the first time in weeks. It wasn't grief this time, it was gratitude. In the following days, traffic stabilized, membership grew again, the sponsor who had paused funding called back and apologized. But the moment changed Lena. She realized that as Ray Human grew, so would the resistance. People would misread vulnerability as weakness. They'd project their own pain into spaces of healing, and she couldn't stop that. But she could lead by example. She set new boundaries for moderators, created a public ethics statement, invited mental health professionals to help refine guidelines and member support, and perhaps most importantly, she began training future hub leaders in other cities, not just to expand, but to decentralize. Ray Human wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the people who showed up week after week to share, to listen, to hold space for one another. That fall, Lena stood once again in front of a room full of strangers, this time in Portland, Oregon, for the opening of the second Ray Human Hub. She watched as a young man read a poem about losing his brother, and a retired nurse told her story of rebuilding a new identity after retirement and divorce. When it was her turn to speak, Lena didn't mention the blog, the backlash, or the storm they'd just come through. She only said this: some days will feel like the day they fired you, some days will feel like the day they buried you, but some days will feel like the first breath after, and that's why we keep going. The applause didn't shake the room, but it filled it warm, lasting. Afterward, she stepped outside alone into the cool night air. The wind wrapped around her like a reminder, like a hand on her back saying, keep going. And she did. Because the world might not always reward kindness, but it needs it more than ever. And Lena Adams would never apologize for leading with her heart.